Hello, in this video we're going to be taking a look at an argument that Bruggencate made in a debate he had with Matt Dillahunty last year.
Why is it reasonable to believe that God exists? Quite simply, because it's true that he exists. Here's my argument. Premise 1. It's reasonable to believe that which is true. Premise 2. It's true that God exists. Conclusion. Therefore, it's reasonable to believe that God exists.
Here's the argument that Bruggencate has just presented. He believes it's a sound argument, and that if Matt is going to attack any premise of it, it's going to be premise 2. He doesn't believe that Matt's going to attack the validity, or that Matt will attack premise number 1. What I'm going to do is attack premise number 1 and the validity of this argument, and show that it's not sound. In particular, premise number 1 has 2 interpretations. And on one interpretation, it's false. And on the other interpretation, premise 1 is true, but the argument is now invalid. So let's look at what the interpretations of premise 1 are. These 2 interpretations are: 1, it is sometimes reasonable to believe that which is true. This is a true interpretation of what Bruggencate has said. And the second interpretation says, it is always reasonable to believe everything that is true. And this is false. And I'll get around to explaining why this is false in a moment. But let me just show you what we have here so far. First of all, we have an argument using the true version of this premise. It is sometimes reasonable to believe that which is true. And it's true that God exists. Therefore, it's reasonable to believe that God exists. Well, this argument is invalid. Just because some things are reasonable to believe if they're true does not mean that other true things are reasonable to believe. For example, it's reasonable for me to believe that 1 plus 1 is 2 because that's self-evident to me. But it may not be reasonable for me to believe that God exists, since the existence of God is not self-evident to me in the same way that 1 plus 1 equals 2 is. So anyway, just because we know that some things are reasonable to believe when they're true does not mean that other things are. So this is an invalid argument. And now we have another version of the same argument. We have the other interpretation of premise 1 here. It says it's always reasonable to believe everything that is true. This is false. I'll explain why in just a moment. The argument now is valid, but since we have a false premise here, it's still unsound. So either way, what Bruggencate has presented here is actually an unsound argument. So here's an argument for why the second interpretation of premise 1 is false. If it is always reasonable to believe everything that is true, then reason should lead to omniscience. But reason does not lead to omniscience, for we have reason but are not omniscient. So of course, there are many things that we do not know. We do not know many details about the past. We do not know many details about what the future is going to bring. We don't know what conditions or inhabitants live on other planets in the universe. There are so many things we don't know. And there are so many true facts that we still don't know despite having reason. So it can't be that these are reasonable for us to know. And so it can't be true that it's always reasonable to believe everything that is true. What makes it reasonable to believe something is having evidence. It's having our belief justified. Now, whether something is reasonable to believe depends on the evidence we have in support of it. When something is unsupported by evidence, it is not yet reasonable to believe it, even if it is true. So it might be true that there are human-like aliens on a planet orbiting the star Sirius. We don't know this is true. We don't know it's not true. But it's not reasonable for us to believe it right now because we have no evidence in support of it. Now let me give you some other examples here. Take these two statements. There is life on Mars and there isn't life on Mars. One of these is true. Right now, each of them seems sort of maybe equally reasonable. On the one hand, we've never discovered life on Mars. And Mars is uninhabitable for life like ours, for the plant and animal life that's common to Earth. Mars is inhospitable to it. On the other hand, bodies of salty water have recently been discovered on Mars, and these might be places where microbial life could evolve. And also, we know that meteors have made it from Mars to Earth, so perhaps meteors have made it from Earth to Mars. There's a chance that microbial life from Earth has made it to Mars. And we know there are extremophile microbes on Earth which live in conditions that we cannot live in. And some of these could live in the conditions on Mars. So it's not so unreasonable that there's life on Mars, but since we don't have firm evidence of this yet, it's not entirely reasonable to believe either one of these. And it's not entirely reasonable to disbelieve them either. Let me show you another example. Okay, pi is a irrational number that has an infinite number of digits after the decimal point, and it's non-repeating. So we have to actually calculate each digit of pi to know what it is. Now, let's take a very large number to refer to a particular digit of pi. Pi has been calculated out to 10 to the power of the 13th, roughly. But googolplex is a much, much larger number. Googolplex is equal to 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 100, which is basically 10 to the power of 1 googol. And one of these statements here is true. The googolplex digit of pi is 0, or it's 1, or it's 2, and so on. We have 10 statements here, each corresponding to one of the digits. So one of these statements is true. But we have no basis for knowing which one it is. So none of these statements is actually reasonable for us to believe right now, even though one of them is in fact true. So just because something is true does not mean that it's reasonable to believe it. The bare truth of something does not make it reasonable to believe. What makes something reasonable to believe is evidence. And we do not have adequate evidence for everything that happens to be true. When we finally gain evidence, then it becomes reasonable to believe something. Evidence may be found through the senses, scientific investigation, detective work, philosophical analysis, or mathematical calculation. Now, so far, we've looked at two different versions of Bruggencate's argument. And both of them are unsound. One has a false premise for the first premise, and the other one is invalid. We can fix both of these problems, and so let's see how we can do this. So here's a version of the same argument which fixes both of these problems. The first premise is true, and the argument is valid. And it goes like this. It's reasonable for me to believe that which I know. 2, I know God exists. Therefore, it's reasonable for me to believe that God exists. So I've made a couple changes to this argument. One is that I've replaced reasonable with reasonable for me. And the other is that I've replaced claims of truth with claims of knowledge. And knowledge is a personal thing. I can know something that you don't. Just because something is true doesn't mean we all know it. So if I know something, of course, then it's reasonable for me to believe it, because knowledge is justified true belief. And if my belief is justified, as it would be if it's knowledge, then it's reasonable for me to hold that belief. So one is tautologically true. Now, I don't actually believe that 2 is true. I know God exists, but Bruggencate believes that he knows God exists. So he could make this argument and consider it a sound argument. And then the conclusion just reflects the changes I made in the two premises. Well, the first one anyways, it's reasonable for me to believe that God exists. The knowledge actually is the middle term in this syllogism, so it doesn't appear in the conclusion. Okay, so this is a valid argument, but there are still some problems with it. Okay, first of all, let me reframe this argument in terms of a particular person, because it's really about a particular person's view. And since I'm not making this argument myself, I've reframed it in terms of Bruggencate, whatever his name is. It's reasonable for Psi to believe that which Psi knows. Okay. 2. Psi knows God exists. Therefore, it's reasonable for Psi to believe that God exists. I'm sure he would accept this as a sound argument. However, this conclusion is not worth that much because it does not establish that it's reasonable for me or for Matt Dillahunty or for other people to believe that God exists. It only establishes that it's reasonable for Psi to believe that God exists. Not really saying enough here. Okay, well, we can reframe this argument again. Bruggencate has said that everyone knows that God exists. So, we'll just plug that in as the second premise and change the first premise to refer to anyone at all. And so it goes like this. It's reasonable for one to believe that which one knows. That's true. It's tautologically true. 2. Everyone knows that God exists. Bruggencate has asserted this. Therefore, it's reasonable for everyone to believe that God exists. And I'm sure Psi would consider this a sound argument. But there are still some problems with this. First of all, those of us who don't believe that God exists are going to reject premise 2. I reject premise 2. Matt Dillahunty would reject premise 2. And so we don't actually get the conclusion that it's reasonable for everyone to believe that God exists. But let's grant, for the sake of argument, that those who are claiming they don't believe that God exists are actually liars or deluded, and that in fact everyone does believe that God exists. And we're just granting this for the sake of argument. Okay, even if we assume that everyone believes God exists, we still have not shown that everyone knows that God exists unless we can produce the justification that everyone has for believing that God exists. And if we can produce this justification, then we've just established the conclusion all on its own, because if we have justification that God exists, then we have reason for believing that it's reasonable to believe that God exists. So, to establish 2, we have to establish the conclusion first. And that makes this argument guilty of circular reasoning. So even after we've fixed up this argument, done the best we can to make it a sound argument, we can't go all the way to make it a sound argument because we don't accept premise 2. But, I've done the best I can to make it one that Bruggencate would consider sound. And even doing this much and even granting him the assumption that everyone at least believes God exists is still a circular argument and fails to prove that it's reasonable for people to believe that God exists. So it's a failure of an argument. This video is based on an article I wrote for my blog. You should find a link down below, and just in case the blog ever goes away, I'm going to page through this a little bit slowly so you can pause it and read it on the screen. You have been watching For the Love of Wisdom, my YouTube channel on free thought, philosophy, and critical thinking. If you've liked this video, please favorite it or share it or like it down below. And if you want to see more videos like this, you can subscribe to For the Love of Wisdom. That's all one word. And let me draw your attention now to some videos on related topics to this one. I have a video called Must We Presuppose God to Account for Existence, which focuses on a particular argument for God's existence. And I have another video here called The Impossibility of Omniscience. I brought up the idea of omniscience in this video, and in this video I argue that omniscience is impossible for many different reasons. And I also have a blog post for that, which goes into greater depth than the original video did.